So in today's chapter of the story, the exiles finally get to go home. Now remember, Judah didn't fall immediately, but because they had rebelled against the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, the cream of all the crop, all the able-bodied people were taken into captivity, and that's what we refer to as the exile. And a few years later, the Jerusalem and Judah itself was ruined and destroyed and all of that sort of thing. And remember, that was part of their discipline. That was, in an odd way, that's what they asked for. It was the bed that they made, so to speak. They had decided they wanted to do things their way instead of God's way. They had rejected his guidelines, and so the consequences were they had no protection, and they fell and fell hard. And because they were not able to represent God the way that they were supposed to, this was the nation that was supposed to help others learn about God. And so while they struggled with that part, the greater story, the greater plan that God had that this nation would birth the Messiah, that was still working. And so they're struggling. They fell. They were taken to the four corners of the ancient world. And finally, it's time. God had said to them through one of his prophets, this is it. You're done. Not extending the opportunity to come back anymore. You're going to fall. You're going to be taken into captivity. But then he sent the message, this will be for 70 years. 70 years of captivity. Go ahead and get comfortable. Plant a garden, settle in. Don't sit there thinking any second now. 70 years, and then I'll bring you back. And so it was time. Other times when they were waiting, it was an indeterminate time. That was a lot harder, I'm sure, but they knew it was going to be 70 years. And so, looking at this story, there's a lot of different ways that this can impact us. There may be somebody that that seems far away from their roots, far away from the presence of God. Maybe has made choices you disagree with, made friends that maybe were not the best. But I think today we can clearly see that there's always a way back, that God's always able to make that way. And here, it sounds simple when it's printed out, but thinking about what actually happened is really quite stupendous. So we look right here at the beginning of the book of Ezra. Well, I'll read it and then I'll tell you my thoughts on this. So, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout the realm and to put it in writing. That's important later. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Anyone of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And the people of any place where survivors may now be living are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods, livestock, and freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. And so the family heads, all the priests, the Levites, they packed their bags, and all their neighbors gave them gold and silver and all these animals and offerings. And then, this is down in verse 7, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the temple of his God. And so Cyrus sent those along, thousands of valuable items from the temple made of gold and silver. There's a list in there. And so he sent them back with a leader who had a nice Babylonian name, I noticed, Sheshbazzar. So this is not quite as exciting and sermon series worthy as the Pharaoh saying, I'm not going to let your people go, and plague after plague, and, pillars of fire and the parting of water. But the same thing happened. People who were slaves in a strange land walked out loaded with gold and silver and animals without any difficulty. That's actually more miraculous than having to put the beat down on an ancient king who was the most powerful person standing on the earth at the time. I mean, it was really, the Pharaoh thought he was a god. He had to be humbled. Cyrus, God just was just like, hey, you should do this. And he's like, all right, there's a miracle right there. How many emperors do you know that are just like, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. I'll give away lots of gold and silver and give away my labor pool. Yeah, sure, no problem. That is a miracle. And we should not overlook it just because it's so simple and easy. I mean, really, by all accounts, we should have gotten another round of plagues to convince this guy to go along with the plan. So maybe that was some of the work of Daniel and friends and, showing the power of God to different people. It's hard to say, but at the very least, his heart was very different from Pharaoh's. And so God speaks, God moves, and it's done. And they're going with resources, with the goods they need. We got this nice list of all the people who went, and they're heading back. And just imagine, the 70 years have passed. God has done exactly what he said. I mean, just picturing the procession, it must have been really something. A chance to start over without all the other stuff. But here's the thing. Anybody ever send a kid to timeout? You ever do that? Maybe that wasn't in vogue when you were a parent. That was kind of the thing when my kids were small. When you let them out of timeout, you kind of expect the behavior to be different than before the timeout. You expect that. I don't know. I'm not saying it always works. I'm just saying that's kind of the whole idea is you're like, okay, have you had a chance to think about, nobody but me ever said this, right? I hope you've thought about what you did wrong. Well, remember, they were in exile because of some just egregious mistakes they had made as a people, some really terrible choices. And I'm sure God intended them to learn some lessons while they were in their 70-year timeout. And if they had jumped right up and started back with the old stuff, who knows how that would have gone down. But we need to see that they've learned something from this. And I think that, it doesn't come right out and say it, but I think it's clear things need to be different now. We had this time. You've had a chance to think about where you went wrong. Let's make sure we get it right this time. And the real test comes. They get back. There's just nothing. There's nothing. And again, we can't compare this. If your house burned to the ground and you had to start from scratch, you could think, what would I do first? But this was a long time ago in a lawless kind of state of the world, and safety. Like, people could just walk up and stab you. I mean, it was really that kind of thing. Wandering tribes could be like, hey, they've got stuff, let's go take that stuff. That was a reality of every day. And yet, what did they do? What did they do? And this is in Ezra chapter 3. Despite their fear, that's a great phrase, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. See, their fear said, worry about yourself. Build a wall. Make spears. Do something. Defend yourself. But what did they start with? The greatest defense of all. If they had been reading their history, they knew the safest place to be is at the feet of God. And they start with worship. And they start working on God's house instead of giving into the fear and worrying about themselves, so to speak. And this is the right place to be. When we're ready to push fear to the side, that doesn't mean we don't fear it. We don't feel it. Sorry, we don't feel the fear. We feel it, but we stick with what God is calling us to do. We put God first despite that, and we start saying, okay, now I can look back and see where I went wrong. I can see the things where I went the wrong direction instead of sticking with God. I can see the people that I associated with that I shouldn't have, whatever it was. I'm going to get it right this time. And so they came back, by all appearances, determined to stay on that right track, to not repeat the errors of their ancestors who decided to, make their own gods and celebrate idols and all that. They were really sticking to it. And it was a great start. And anybody know what happens when God's people get on track? Some of you know from very hard personal experience. When God's people get on track, there's going to be attacks. It's a mathematical certainty is what it is. It is A equals B kind of equation. As soon as God's people get focused and determined, something is going to happen. It's happened to us. It's happened to every church that's ever gotten their act together at any point in their history. It's happened to us as individuals. This is how it works. And sure enough, there's a section. Let me see, it's not very far in. They start rebuilding in chapter 3. They're starting to work on the temple. Oh, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. They laid the foundation. The old timers start crying because they remembered the original. The newcomers had never seen a temple before. They were so excited, so there's like crying and cheering all at the same time, and nobody knew which was which. What a day. They're praising God. They know that's working. And immediately, the next paragraph, opposition to the rebuilding, if you have the NIV like I do. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him." Isn't that interesting? We want to volunteer for the Buildings and Grounds Committee. And they wisely said, "Listen, you have no part in this. No part at all." Now that seems a little weird, doesn't it? You could take that out of context and be like, what awful people to not let volunteers help at church. How could they turn away willing hands when they were short-staffed? Would we do that? If somebody walked up and said, "Hey, I really want to help with your ministries," we would have to protect them from our nominating committee, wouldn't we? But this made me think, I don't know if this has ever happened here. I've only been around a few years. But I have seen churches get so desperate to fill slots that they would get the directory. Okay. I was hoping nobody would be like, "Oh yeah, we do that." No. This is bad, okay? I'm just saying, get the church directory and okay, we need deacons. How about so-and-so? How about so-and-so? How about so-and-so? He's 11. Oh. Churches ever get to where they would just take a warm body, put them in a position just because they said yes? Oh, yeah. Is that a good thing? Not always. So it seemed like they wanted to help, but they were just trying to infiltrate and ruin everything. That's what they were doing. It's a little uncomfortable to think that someone might volunteer to be a part of things at church and then mess those things up. Let's move on. I don't want to talk about that anymore. That wasn't it. It didn't stop there. They said, "Hey, listen, we're doing this. We know what you guys are up to." But then, this is verse 4, the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah. "You'll never get that done. It's not going to work. You don't have the right now. You're not lining that up right. It's all going to fall down. Oh, just wait. Something's going to happen. And then they worked on fear, make them afraid to go on building. Oh, fear's always in the mix, isn't it? Oh, man, you work on the temple. Somebody could be robbing your house right now. Waste all your time on that. Oh, not going to have enough crops for the winter. Just wait. And look at this. They hired counselors to work against them. Lobbyists. Lobbyists. To frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius. And so they weren't just like there on site trying to bring them down, sow fear and frustration and discouragement. They were also lobbying the kings and being like, these people, they're dangerous. You let them get to work. All kinds of bad stuff. And that eventually takes hold. Later in chapter 4, we see them sending an official letter to the kings. This place, they have a long history of sedition and uprisings. They're rebellious people. You let them finish building, you're going to have nothing but trouble. And so the king calls for a halt to the building in the city. It works. It works. And unfortunately, they're like, hey, you guys have to stop building. And the Israelites are like, okay. It doesn't give us anything in between. They might have just been following the law. They might have been, forced at spear point. I don't know. But it seems like they just kind of let it go and gave in. And maybe the discouragement and the fear and all the other stuff had built up, and then this was the last straw. It's hard to tell. But at some level, even though they seemed aware that the enemy was out to get them, they still, at some point, thought, you know what? I'm just going to go work on my house. You go work on your house. Let's take care of ourselves here. And despite all the time they had gotten it right, they just kind of drifted off maybe. We talked about this in Sunday school some. We don't think there was just a day when they all were like, we're not doing this anymore. It was probably more like people just thought of things they needed to work on. And maybe were a little less enthusiastic. And maybe just skipped one day and then the next day was easier to skip. And then they just thought, I have so much to do at home. My house isn't safe. My future isn't taken care of. I think just a little by little, they gave up. That's just a guess. That just seems to be how people do. And here's what they never anticipated. So they start giving in to the fear. They let the discouragement take hold. They let their priorities shift. They kind of lose that discipline of putting God first and God's projects first and temple first, self later. They lose that, and everything else just kind of goes to pieces. And this is the thing that humans just get wrong and mess up over and over and over. Even us humans who go to church, we mess this up over and over. And the more they worked on saving their money, the less money they had. And the more they worked on their own farms, the less food they had. And the more they tried to take care of their water supply, the thirstier they were. Nothing was paying off. Why? Because they didn't keep God at the center. They didn't let the first thing be the first thing. They didn't seek first the Lord and his righteousness. And all those things that would have been added that they were seeking over, they were just gone. And that's Haggai was one of the great prophets during this time. And here's another opportunity where we see the people have a chance to show that things are different. And so Haggai comes to them and he says, is this really the time for you to be living in your nice paneled houses while God's house is a ruin? Think. See, it sounds like a parent. Give careful thought to your ways. You've planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes, you're not warm. You earn wages and it's like your purse has a hole in it. Give careful thought care of my house. See, you wanted much for yourself, but it turned out to be little. You built things, and I knocked them down. That's why there's a drought going on, as I'm withholding the water. We want to be the kind of people that respond like this. And this is a rarity. Those of you who have been with us through the different phases of the story, usually the prophets would say, you got to get this straight. And they'd be like, shut up and leave us alone. Paraphrasing. They heard this for maybe the first time. It's hard to tell. At least this time, right? You can see they've been changed by their experiences because they hear that and they're like, yes, we've messed up. And this is one of the hardest things for us to master. I don't know if we ever master this. That might not be the right word. It's hard to accept correction. It's hard to deliver correction, to be sure. That is a really awkward thing. But receiving it, that's difficult. Sometimes we get it. We're reading the scriptures and we see ourselves. Sometimes we hear God communicating with us and we know, and it hurts. And sometimes somebody who loves us is the one who has to say, look, you're really blowing this. And that's hard to take. Just if that ever happens to you, make sure you breathe several times before you say anything. But we have to consider the source. Did your parents ever say that? Consider the source. If it's somebody who is not like you are sure they love you, then you might not take it too seriously. But just because they don't like you or that you disagree with them doesn't mean they're 100% wrong. And so this is a hard thing, and I've had to work a lot on this during my career, I assure you. Taking something that you don't agree with, that you think is completely wrong from a person that you actually dislike, and just saying, okay, God, was there any truth in that? Any truth at all? Anything I need to work on, even if I think that person is a jerk? Right? That's hard, but we need to do it. But if it's someone that we love, that loves us, you remember, a friend's wounds can be trusted, then we have to keep the blast doors up and listen and hear and be corrected sometimes. And see, by their track record, this was maybe the most miraculous thing yet. They heard Haggai speaking to them, Zechariah as well, and they listened and they said, we're getting back on this. We're bringing God back to the center. And we'll talk next week and days to come about what happens after that. But we need to remember that no matter how far afield a person, a group has gotten, God can still bring us back. There's no one that is too far gone, too far exiled. There's no such thing. If God can take, again, these ancient kings who had made their name by conquering and destroying, these were not super sensitive, kind, giving people. They were rulers with iron fists. If God can make this kind of guy just be like, you know what, you're free and take all this gold with you. What's beyond God in terms of working on hearts? We've already talked about how God gives us the experiences we need to learn, the lessons we need to learn. We just need to be ready to accept those, to hear those, to act on them, to move forward in new ways, not repeat the same mistakes over and over. We've got to work on keeping, somebody, I'm sure this is from a movie or something, the main thing is keeping the main thing the main thing. And if we can work on that, see, the problem is it's not exciting every day. If it was exciting every day, it'd be easy, but it's not. It's a routine, and it can become a drag, and some days you're just like, can I just stay in bed, for goodness sake? Can I just spend the day on the couch? That's why they're called spiritual disciplines. Does anybody else hear that word and just think, oh, Lord help me? Just the idea, and because they take work and they're hard. And it's just like exercise. You dread it, but then you do it and you feel better. We all know that. And yet, there I am on the sofa. We just have to ignore the threats, the fear, the discouragement, all the things. And this is what the devil specializes in. And his delivery systems are beyond number. All those things, whether it comes like thoughts in our head or voices or people or whatever, all these reasons not to do what God wants us to do, what we know God wants us to do. We got to just, at the very least, learn from mistakes. Our mistakes, their mistakes. That's why we have these stories. Make sure we don't do the same thing over and over. So 5 minutes, 15 minutes. Who's counting? That was pretty fast. I mean, I had a lot to say. But again, just as Betty Lee's settling in, because we're very active, when we're very focused, we need to expect that the devil will attack us regularly. Try to get different ones of us to stay home. Try to get different ones of us to argue with each other. Anything but keep pursuing our mission. That's what happens when God's people get their act together. And on the grand scale, we're a little more together than most churches. I'm not going to go all, like I did last week. So we should expect that. We need to remember that keeping God at the center is our only defense against those attacks. We're going to have our hymn of commitment now, Higher Ground, number 484. Let's stand and sing together. May we always be seeking that higher ground. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.